So I'm going to call this meeting to order at 6 p.m. Can I get an approval of the agenda? Yeah. Councillor Tozo, seconded by, nobody's paying attention, seconded by Councillor Shaves. All in favor? Okay, so can I get a confirmation of the minutes for the Environment, Infrastructure, and Transportation Policies Committee meeting number 04-2024, held on April 9th, 2024, be approved, and that minutes of the Special Environment, Infrastructure, and Transportation Policies Committee meeting number 05-2024, held on Tuesday, April 24th, 2024, be approved. All in favor? Yeah, you want to move?
No. I forwarded earlier some comments to be modified within the minutes, so I just want to make that
I think
known.
we need to move and then second and then discussion if there is. Okay, so moved by Councillor Shave, seconded by Councillor Amos. So discussion?
Well, as stated, I had forwarded some modifications. Were some of the comments which I made during one of the previous minutes. So I had forwarded that, and I'd like to make known that those are going to be amended.
Through the chair, I have received those, and I will make those adjustments before I post the minutes. Thank you.
Any other adjustments?
I don't agree with Councillor Shaves' adjustments, so I cannot vote for the minutes. Thank you.
Okay, so all in favor of the approval of the confirmation of the minutes with Councillor Shaves? Okay, all in favor. That passes. Against? Okay, Tozo is against. All right, so are there any disclosures of pecuniary interest? Seeing as none, so we have delegations. So I remind all delegations they have 5 minutes to speak, and then after that, committee members only have 2 questions. So I'll invite Joyce Hoyston to come and speak, to speak to the committee regarding the Yards Bylaw Update Report.
Can you go to the previous slide, actually? Oh, sorry. Duh. Thank you. I just want to say, awesome, this new yard bylaw, and how important it is that this yard bylaw is coming to council now and being passed. Well, hopefully being passed. And the slide I have up there, this comes from the Ecological Design Lab from Metropolitan University, Nina Marie Lister. She is the key lead in that lab, and she's been working on bylaws for biodiversity and put a whole set of resources up for cities to use and for citizens like master gardeners here to work towards a bylaw for biodiversity. And with Kingston's bylaw that's before you now, working with Kyle at the city has been really awesome in moving us towards really being an exemplar city around bylaws for biodiversity. We'll have a few hopes that we're asking for modifications, but otherwise I just want to say this is great. Why does biodiversity matter? I won't go into this too much other than to say this bylaw, think about it in terms of biodiversity. So if you get citizen complaints, which you probably will, because there are people who love their manicured lawns and think a naturalized yard looks messy, biodiversity is really one of the ways to address that. Biodiversity is about life, really. It's like the birds, the insects, it's the life on Earth. And everything is interconnected, everything is intertwined. We pull one thread and lots could collapse. So the health of ecosystems is related to biodiversity, and our city is an ecosystem. And they're even now realizing that the biodiversity of our gut, our probiotics, is related to the biodiversity around us. 2.9 billion birds gone since 1970. We're in an insect crisis as well. And birds are considered a keystone indicator that there's something wrong. So this bylaw is moving towards helping to address that. And now there's a recognition by the UN that the biodiversity and the climate crisis are completely intertwined. And so this bylaw will help both with climate and with biodiversity. Chickadees, I don't know if you guys know that chickadees need 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to feed their babies, to raise one nest. And those caterpillars need plants. They need our native plants to eat. And then the chickadees feast on those caterpillars. So this is the interconnection of life. And this is a yard that 3 years ago would not have had this chickadees nesting in the yard, but because of 3 years of naturalization, now does. And they have had 2 bylaw complaints, by the way, but our bylaw, I think, has already been working or acting as if, or with a recognition of the importance of naturalized yards, because they said the yard looked fine. All Our Relations Land Trust, probably most of you or all of you have heard about it. One of the things that I have learned from working on the land there is that food sovereignty isn't just about humans, it's for all our relations. And so again, this bylaw, by supporting biodiversity, is supporting food sovereignty for all, for humans and for non-humans. Now, the Thousand Island Master Gardeners have been working with bylaw around this new bylaw, updated bylaw. And we do a lot of educational work. And last year for the No Mow May campaign, around the pollinator policy, we always create content and do educational webinars to support. So for No Mow May last year, we did a No Mow May page, we did a Living Lawns page, we did a ticks page, and we did webinars to support those. And our plan going forward is to continue with that educational content with this new bylaw. And you can see in those drop downs up there some of the content that we really built up to support homeowners to naturalize and to educate against some of the myths around
30 seconds.
naturalized yards. So we have 3 recommendations I'm going to go through really fast. Number 1, remove the Weed Control Act from the definition of prohibited plants. It's confusing to have them both in there, and they're basically duplicated. And the Weed Control Act is for rural or for agricultural areas. And I won't talk about those. Recommendation 2, just add non-native, the word non-native, to the definition of turf grass to avoid confusion, because native lawns
Thank
are
you.
becoming a thing.
That's been 5 minutes.
Are we done?
So
Okay.
are there any questions from the committee? Yeah, Councillor Hassan.
Continue to explain, because myself, I'm confused too, with the turf lawn and those, the natural plants we have, how are we going to take it? So please explain, that is a very important explanation.
The turf grass lawn
Yeah,
versus...
what is the difference between taking care of the turf grass lawn, the lawn, and the other plants, or the weed?
Yeah, a turf grass lawn is really a monoculture of non-native European grasses. And being non-native European grasses, they require water, they require pesticides, which fortunately this city banned years ago, but you still see people with their spot sprayers out. They use organic pesticides now, and they still use herbicides on the lawns. And a monoculture lawn, it's like any monoculture, is not stable. So the grubs come in, which is why the pesticides were used, and people still find a way around it. Whereas a native lawn is a diverse lawn of a mix of native grasses, and if it's a low-growing one, there will be perennial plants in there as well, flowering plants, which could still potentially be mowed. So if people like things short, they can mow once a month, every 6 weeks, and those lawns will actually stay green without water, because they would be a mix of plants adapted for kind of our climate, our conditions, not the European moisture conditions. Does that answer? And so, just adding the native to that definition, the reason I'm suggesting that is because Cornell University, for example, has been researching different native grasses for lawns, and some of those native grasses could potentially hit slightly above that height limit. So there is a height limit still kept in the bylaw. And the height limit doesn't apply for plants or for the naturalized yards, but if turf grass doesn't have the non-native, there is a risk, and I'm sure bylaw would be aware of that, but just to make it clear, I think would be good.
Any other questions? Seeing as none, or do you have a question? Yeah, Councillor Osanik?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, was there some points that you wanted us to change in the bylaw? Because you had mentioned that earlier.
Yeah, so the one that you're still seeing up there is a very minor one about removing asphalt from the definition of keeping your ground covered. And the reason, and actually bylaw was really great, and I hadn't noticed that in there before, otherwise I would have mentioned it when we were working with Kyle, because the English ivy and the periwinkle, 2 invasive plants, were in there previously, but asphalt being non-permeable, being really a fossil fuel product that's not good for the environment, that will increase heat island effect and reduce our stormwater runoff, I just think it'd be better not to have it in there, to suggest, because it might encourage people to say, oh, I'll just asphalt over my yard. And then the other one that was the removing the Weed Control Act, which I kind of briefly touched on, but the reason I think that should be removed from there is that it's for rural areas. Prince Edward County kept it because they are a rural area. Toronto did not because they're an urban area. And having both lists can be confusing. And then some of the species on the Weed Control Act, like milkweed, used to be on there. And milkweed was on there because it's a spreader and it can get into the fields. And if the cows eat it, they might get sick. And it was urban citizens concerned about monarchs that got that removed from the list. There's like sow thistle, which is a medicinal plant, and some people grow it for medicines, and that's on the Weed Control Act list. And then it's also harder to enforce because it's a long list versus the short, sweet, prohibited plants list that are a problem here in urban Kingston. So I think restricting it to that short list would just make things educational easier and easier for bylaw.
Okay, thank you. No other questions? All right, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we'll move on to Lorraine Johnson. So you have 5 minutes, and your time starts now.
Thanks so much for this opportunity to speak with the committee tonight. My name's Lorraine Johnson, and I write books about native plant gardening and naturalization. My first book on this subject was called The Ontario Naturalized Garden, and it was published 30 years ago. And in the past 30 years, I've seen such an incredible growing interest in naturalization and supporting pollinators, and it's great to see Kingston revising its bylaw in such a great direction in support of pollinators. So I really want to commend you, and I want to commend staff member Kyle for such a thoughtful report full of such care and his collaborative spirit in working on this. I'm also very active because I write books about naturalization and have been writing them for such a long time. And as Joyce mentioned, writing them at a time when milkweed was a prohibited plant. The only known larval host plant for an endangered butterfly was on the noxious weed list. So there have been these incredible changes. But because I work in this area of naturalization, I'm also very active in advocating for the modernization of property standards bylaws. And I've worked with many cities. I was one of the subject matter experts invited by the City of Toronto to consult over a period of a year on on the revisions to Toronto's bylaw, and I've worked with other municipalities as well and individuals. So I am delegating tonight in support of this, the revised bylaw, and to commend Kingston and the council on this really great step forward. I think it will make have a positive impact on the health of the environment in Kingston by allowing residents to create habitat gardens in support of pollinators. I do have, like Joyce, I have a couple of comments, small tweaks really. Yes, adding the word non-native in the before the word perennial grasses in the definition of turf grasses. Native grasses are incredibly important for pollinators. And so, in support of your goal of allowing and supporting pollinators, I'd encourage you to add that word non-native to the definition of turf grass. But the most important change, I would highly recommend that you remove the Ontario Weed Control Act's Not Just Weed list. The ministry itself has said it does not apply to areas such as cities, so it just creates such confusion for residents. And that really what you need to be concerned about are the local weeds, the local context, the municipal context in Kingston, and those locally problematic plant species are identified in the report. Those 4 species recommended as local concern for prohibition. And so to stick with those, I think it is what's relevant for the Kingston context. As Joyce mentioned, Toronto decided at the urging of a group of 13 subject matter experts not to include the noxious the plants that are on the noxious weed list, precisely because they don't apply in the urban situation. At the end, after there is a clause in the Toronto revised bylaw that the legal department added that says nothing in this bylaw shall affect the application enforcement of the Weed Control Act with respect to noxious weeds. And it was explained to me that they included it because the lawyers said that provincial law trumps municipal law. But since the provincial law specifically says it doesn't apply in municipal, in urban areas, it just completely creates confusion for residents. So, and I would also just mention that London went through a recent bylaw revision.
30 seconds.
Thanks. It just recently revised its bylaw, and it also included a clause clarifying that, again, because provincial law trumps municipal law, that if there is a context in which the Provincial Weed Control Act applies, then it will be, but that's only for noxious weeds that are close enough, i.e. within, I think it's within a kilometer or more of municipal lands. Thanks a lot.
So any questions from committee? No questions? All right, so thank you very much. So we'll move on to briefings, and there are none. So now for our under business, there's the Yards bylaw update. So can I have staff introduce this report?
Thank you, and through you. The staff are really excited to bring this report to the committee tonight, as we feel that this is a progressive change and an alignment towards the strategic goals that the city has currently with the climate action. The amendments proposed tonight deal with a lot of subjective wording that is within the bylaws right now, so we wanted to clarify such references as the vague terminologies, again, unsightly weeds, heavy undergrowth, vague terminology that we do have case law precedent on that creates difficult understanding with the residents. So we have come to first clean up that language and try to make it a lot more, again, comparable to what other municipalities have shown before us. This bylaw is also introducing pollinator and naturalized lawns to the city of Kingston, which we're quite excited about. Again, there's a lot of views on climate action and how we should take progressive steps. So staff have done quite a comprehensive review on steps we can take, again, to go into the direction of council to fight climate action. And I think throughout this report, it demonstrates quite simple things that we can do as the municipality to go forward in some of, again, council's strategic priorities. We have reflected 2 other changes. So we have created a prohibited plants list. And that list is quite small, like the delegates have mentioned. We've worked closely with the Thousand Islands Master Garden Association, and we have, again, worked with the Indigenous groups of the City of Kingston to identify what should be on this prohibited plants list. And then we are also creating an overwatch list into the future to understand if there should be noxious or if there should be any kind of plants to be added as we go into the future. So we're working closely with the experts to understand what we should go to into the future, but to create a small, simplistic list of prohibited plants is what staff have recommended before you. We're also looking at amendments in a creation of an AMP for recreational vehicles. And then we've also looked at inoperable vehicles as well. So for enforcement services, we do receive quite a bit of concerns for derelict vehicles. So that would be vehicles that are missing parts, windshields, that are sort of, whether it's a project or whether it's sort of in notion of a wrecking yard that have been established in residential areas. We do get quite a bit of calls for that. And it's treated quite comparable to refuse and debris. So the fine amounts are sort of the same. And the only way that we can deal with that sort of situation is by going through the court system. So we're looking for a less punitive way to deal with that, but by creating sort of a more simplistic penalty on that.
Thank you very much. So I'll turn to the committee. Is there any questions from the committee? Councillor Tozo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, through you. A few questions. First is, so when we're talking about naturalized lawns, we're still leaving, I'm reading through the bylaw, it's still a maximum of 8 inches for the amount of turf grass that's allowed. So that is not changing at all, right?
Through you, that's correct.
Okay. Second question, I just want to be clear on that because I know I'm going to get questions about like, oh, we're letting grass grow crazy. And so people still have to keep their lawns mowed other than May. Second question is actually for the use and storing of parking of recreation vehicles. So it's a $200 fine. Obviously, you take an educational approach. Is there progressive fines, or is it like a $200 fine and $200 fine? Like, is that just the maximum penalty, or can you put more $200 fines if someone's just not doing this?
Yeah, it's a good question through you. So obviously for the enforcement services approach, that is our approach: education, warning, working with the resident to understand how they can become into compliance with their violations. But we don't have set fines for this specific infraction. The way it's written right now is through the court system by way of a Part 3 summons. So we're looking at a more less punitive measure, and that's through the AMP system. So again, education, warnings, working with the resident. If it does come to a point of they're in violation, we have to issue a penalty notice. This is the less punitive measure before going to the court system, but it would be $200, and then it could escalate through the court system.
And thank you. Follow-up question. So if someone's vehicle wanted to be towed, we could tow that vehicle off that property and fine them that expense. Is that correct? Yes, no?
You're talking for derelict vehicles?
Yeah.
Yeah. There's situations where if it's harming if there's oil spills, that type of nature, and if we do get to the court system, we can also tow. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Amos.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, through you. I have a series of questions, so I'm just going to reference the page number and then dive into the questions. So the first one is on page 9 of 39. And it starts off with staff intend to promote the existing resources and materials offered by the Thousand Islands Master Gardeners. My only comment in that would be, is there a way to set up some webinars of some kind for our public to dive in and do some educational workshops? I know in the past when city has offered that type of platform, we've had hundreds of people attend, and I think that's an avenue that we need to explore.
Thank you, and through you, absolutely. It's something that we're definitely wishing to explore right now. We are working close with Joyce and the Thousand Islands Master Gardeners, and they do their webinars as well. We're looking to promote this very heavily in the fall as well, based on the staff or the council decision. But there's going to be an educational awareness campaign followed after the decision of this bylaw, and that would be part of it.
Perfect. In the last paragraph of that same page, so page 9 of 39, the following lists of prohibited plants are proposed in the amending bylaws. What happens if someone doesn't know they have an offending plant? Like, what steps do your officers take?
It's a good question, and through you. So we see that many municipalities put the onus on the complainant when they're calling into enforcement services and they're identifying that there is a prohibited plant that they've become aware of or that they have concern of. The onus is on the complainant to identify that the prohibited plant. So that's one step we can take as the city. If the resident was to call us in with a concern, we would ask if they can identify what plant on the list that would be in violation. And then again, it's through that educational approach where we would go out, understand what the nature of the situation is, if it's a property owner that is creating a naturalized lawn or garden, or if it's a vacant landowner for say, try to get an understanding of the scope of the situation and then work to educate and then go from there.
Perfect, thank you. On page 15 of 39, now it's getting into the bylaw. Section J, and it's A, keeping the grounds or yards for the turf grass at 8 inches, and I think Councillor Tozo asked this, but is this a standard, the 8 inches or 20 centimeters, is that a standard across Ontario, or is that arbitrary for what we're picking?
From our municipal comparison, it's a standard across Ontario. It's the same across 8.2 or 20 centimeters.
Okay. B, I wanted to touch on, but I think you've already answered that. Notice the question was, what steps are, if they don't know what is prohibited, but you've answered that, so thank you. Page 16 of 39. Section N, number 5. And it's just to confirm, we're talking private dwellings and not commercial.
Sorry, just one second, Councillor.
So this would be the motor vehicle
Yes.
inoperative? Yeah.
Yes, we
Okay.
are.
Section P, same section. Are we proposing that you can't store any vehicles, any recreation vehicles in driveways, or are we still, is this still referencing certain size RVs?
Thank you, and through you. So everything is still the same. What we are doing is we're keeping all the definitions and the regulations within the zoning bylaw the same, but we are just adding an administrative monetary penalty to the violation. So it is still the same, we're just converting it over.
Okay. My last question, you've got a large number of bylaw officers, I'm suspecting, that are not very familiar with plant origins and what is good and what isn't. Is there going to be training provided and ongoing training provided?
Yes, thank you for the question. Absolutely. Again, we're working with our subject matter experts to come in and provide training and just go through each step of the new progressive bylaw. If it does get approved by council.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Stephen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, through you. Thanks for these updates. This is very exciting, and I'm so pleased to see all the collaboration that's been happening behind the scenes. That's excellent. My one question is about asphalt as a suitable ground covering. That came up in the conversation already in our delegations. And I notice in the amendments that are proposed, it's talking about keeping the grounds, yard, or vacant land free from soil erosion by covering the ground in da-da-da-da-da. Could staff please explain to us why asphalt is one of the listed options? Thanks.
Thank you, and through you. So this provision has been carried over, again, from the existing property standards bylaw. And again, while staff appreciate the concern with respect to the environmental impacts of asphalt, this material, again, remains pretty predominant material for the construction of residential driveways. And it would not be, again, it's somewhat realistic to remove asphalt as a suitable form of ground cover at this time. It is really to note that asphalt is merely listed as an example of the type of ground cover. Residents, again, are free to use alternatives, forms of ground covers should they choose to.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. And so I think when I first read this report, I was thinking that yards was yards, right? Like the grass and the flowers and all that kind of stuff. But I think what I'm understanding, I just want to check, is yards includes driveways. Is that right? It's everything that's not the municipal property?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? All right. Councillor Tozo.
Since you insisted. Just one question for verification. So if we deleted asphalt from the list, how much of an effect would that have on residentials? Would that mean that people wouldn't be allowed to have asphalt driveways?
No, that won't be the case, Your Honor. I'll pass it to my colleague, Ms. Morley.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. No, that would not prohibit individuals from using asphalt as a form of ground cover. We merely list that as an example. So if it were removed, it would have no impact either way.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Hassan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you. My apology for not being a lawyer. This language I tried to read through a couple times and try to understand the section, subsection, and how to do it. But I will summarize my question simply, what I like to understand from myself as well. For example, if I have lawn, my front yard, which is clean, and it's just the turf grass, which I tried to ask the question to the delegate too. What is the obligation to maintain or cut the grass during that May month, or with this new bylaw?
Thank you, and through you. So for no mow May, we allow the grass to go and exceed the height limits throughout the month of May. For regular months outside of the month of May, there's a height restriction for turf grass. So that would be the restriction that we would continue to enforce, and that would again be the 20 centimeter regulation. So for basic turf grass, there's a height restriction to it.
So simply, again, whatever the changing we are making is still voluntarily. The people want to participate, they will participate. But if somebody complain about my backyard or lawn that grass is too big, or I have the weeds up there, and so that bylaw will not affect me, or the bylaw will not go for that particular month because we are allowing the resident, but it's still volunteers. After that, we will force the bylaw to keep the ground maintained, well maintained. That is my understanding, right?
That's correct.
Okay. It's completely, because I have few emails, people are confused still. If we're gonna, with these changing, we're gonna continue to force the bylaw to cite them if they're not maintaining after that settlement, or they have to stop cutting the grass or doing whatever they want to do with their the backyard or for front lawn. So that's why I asked this question. It's still volunteer, but it's just only if somebody, like my neighbor complained about my backyard or my lawn, as nothing can be done by law. So this month, I'm free to do whatever I want to do. I want to cut it or I don't want to cut it.
Yeah, and again, for turf grass specifically, so turf grass is different from naturalized lawns. Naturalized lawns or
I understand that part, but I'm saying, let's say let it grow my backyard,
right.
and that's no problem for one month. I can let it grow to participate in this program.
Correct.
But after that, I'm okay to maintain that.
Correct. Correct. Sorry.
The other question is about the recreational vehicle. Are we recommending any change to the length of that? How big the vehicle they can park for how long? But I understand also the non-operative vehicles park for a long time on the people's the driveways. Those need to be removed. And I really appreciate looking into that because in my own district, we have a lot of issues, a lot of problems. And as I talked to you a few days ago, that was one particular address has that issue as well. But with the recreational vehicle, we're not making any change into the length of the vehicle, the time of the vehicle when it's parked, it remains same, but we're just adding penalties into it.
That's correct, Councillor. We're not making any changes to the zoning bylaw right now. This is just to impose an administrative monetary penalty.
How we will deal the unanimous call for against those recreational vehicles? Somebody just called, oh, there's just, Jimmy parked his recreational vehicle up there and it's blocking my view and it's blocking, I cannot see to coming out. And how are we dealing with those unanimous calls? Because sometimes I have been dealing since I got elected with this. It's a real problem. People bring their recreational vehicle to just clean it up for a couple hours or maybe day. But then I start getting email, oh, that should not be there, that my neighbor keep parking up there, it's blocking my view, I can't walk through, and this and that. But how are we gonna maintain that standard, let the resident know who own recreational vehicle that when they can do clean up their vehicle, bring it to their homes?
Thank you, and through you. I think it's a good question. In terms of enforcement, it's been rather difficult because if we provide education and having those conversations and individuals are not willing to relocate based on whatever violation, whether it's a sightline concern, what have you, the only mechanism we have right now is to go through a summons process, which ties us up into the courts, and ultimately we can't make any kind of enforcement immediate decisions until that decision is made through the courts. What I'm trying to do with this report is to create a less punitive fine amount so that it's another step that enforcement can take to seek compliance because we are seeing those challenges, Councillor.
Last question to Ms. Marley. Ms. Marley, is that possible that legally we can create or we can allow the owner of those recreational vehicles, if we allow them to buy a specific permit by paying that through from the summer start to the end, for certain days, for certain time, they can bring their vehicle to clean up, refuel it, whatever they want to do it. But they will know they have a permit for specific days, for specific time. So we don't start getting calls and we don't have to deploy the bylaw officers. Is that possible? We can create something, some program like that?
Through you, Mr. Chair, without delving too much into the world of planning, I can tell you that the permit system was recommended by members of the public back in 2019 when these regulations were extensively debated and included in the city's zoning bylaw. And city staff ultimately decided not to go with that approach and have included detailed regulations with respect to the parking of these vehicles instead. I will be clear that any amendments with respect to the parking of recreational vehicles would have to be achieved through a zoning bylaw amendment, not through the process that we're attempting to achieve tonight, which is simply to change the way in which we enforce these types of infractions.
Any other questions? Councillor Osenik?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just two questions. One is inoperative motor vehicles, just because we have the definition in here. I know that we're just changing tonight the way that penalties are paid, right? But does that include a vehicle that has a completely flat tire You know, sometimes we see that on the driveways.
Through you, yes, it would.
It would, eh? Okay, so we could report it?
Yep.
Okay, great. And my second question is, you have the definition in there, and it refers to like dog waste on the yards. Does that include backyards too? I get a lot of complaints from neighbors about dog waste in someone's backyard and they don't clean it up.
And through you, yep, it would could fall under our property standards bylaw, so that would be something we would look at. We got
Okay.
it through measures of the animal control bylaw, municipal property, but for private property, it would fall under our property standards bylaw. It would be something our officers could look at.
Okay, in the backyard. And then the last question, just part of that is, what about all these new condo subdivisions that we're building? Does that change things? Because bylaw doesn't apply, right? So what happens with the condo subdivisions?
Ms. Morley?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I would argue that in the context of a condominium, there are likely to be extra protections in place. The city can, in fact, enforce its municipal bylaws on any type of privately owned property. Our enforcement measures would likely be against the condo corporation in that circumstance. But in most cases, the condominium corporation itself is going to have extensive rules around that for its residents and have its own means of enforcement as well.
Interesting. Yeah, thanks, because my friend always has that problem. She lives in a really tiny townhouse with the one next door neighbor, and when she phones the city, they say they can't do anything. So, okay, I'm going to tell her to keep calling the city. Thank you.
Thank you. Now everybody's asked questions. So now we'll move on to the public portion of the meeting. And you have 5 minutes, and only if you have not already spoken. So is there anyone wishing to speak to this report in the room? Seeing as none, is there anyone online who wishes to speak?
Through you, Mr. Chair, there is one member in the public viewing gallery on Zoom. If you wish to speak to the report, please raise your virtual hand. It's located at the bottom of your screen, and they'll let me know you wish to speak. I'm not seeing any movement, Mr. Chair.
All right, so can I get a mover and a seconder? Moved by Councillor Tozo, seconded by Councillor Hazan. Is there any discussion? Seeing as none, I'll call the vote. All in favor? And that passes unanimously. Okay, so motions, there are none. There are no notices of motions. Is there any other business? As no correspondence, or we've already received it. So the date of the next meeting for the Environment, Infrastructure, and Transportation Policies Committee is scheduled for Tuesday, August 6, 2024 at 6 p.m. Can I get a mover and seconder for adjournment? Moved by Councillor Shaves, second by Councillor Amos. All in favor? And good night, everyone.